Now, the grand design opened, and this intrigued me, with a list of the big questions that people have always asked. How does the universe behave? What is the nature of reality? Where did all this come from? Did the universe need a creator? And I thought, this is going to be very interesting. Hawking is now going to treat these philosophical questions with rigor. Well, I got a shock, because Hawking at once dismisses philosophy. He lists his questions, and then he says, traditionally, these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. It is not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly in physics. And as a result, scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. Well, I was startled by this, to say the least, because, of course, his questions are all philosophical questions. His statement about philosophy is dead, is itself a philosophical statement. It's certainly not a statement of science. It is a metaphysical statement. And therefore, because his statement claims that philosophy is dead, when I then read that his book is all about philosophy, I get slightly disturbed that there's a bit of basic and fundamental lack of understanding behind it. But let's have a look at the logic, because the major conclusion of Hawking's book is this: because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. Now, when I read that sentence, I thought, what? And then I read it again, and then I read it again, and then I spent many hours thinking about it, because this is the central conclusion and statement of the book. Well, the first obvious question to ask is, what does Hawking mean by nothing? Because his assumption, because there is a law of gravity, seems to be postulating there is something. The law of gravity certainly isn't nothing. And if he believes in a law of gravity that's prior in some sense, I presume he believes in gravity, because the existence of a law on its own without the thing it's describing would be essentially vacuous. I'll return to that in a moment. But the main point at the first level of logical analysis of this conclusion is that gravity, or a law of gravity, is not nothing. That is, if Hawking is using the word in its usual sense, philosophically correct, that is, of non-being. Now, if he isn't, he should have told us. So it appears, at first sight at least, that Hawking is simultaneously asserting that the universe is both created from nothing and from something, which is not a very promising start. Now, of course, I'm well aware that often when physicists speak about nothing, they don't mean nothing at all. They mean a quantum vacuum, which is manifestly not nothing, and Hawking alludes to it later in the book. I'm tempted to say, ladies and gentlemen, that all of this is a little bit too much ado about nothing. Now, the situation doesn't improve when we move to the logic of the second part of his statement. The universe can and will create itself. Now, if we say X creates Y, the meaning of those words are that we presuppose the existence of X to explain the existence of Y. That's a simple matter of the meaning of the words. So if I say X now creates X, it means I'm presupposing the existence of X to explain the existence of X, which is, of course, logically incoherent, even if we set X equal to the universe, which is precisely what Hawking does at this point. And to presuppose the existence of the universe to account for its own existence, to my mind, is something out of Alice in Wonderland, not out of science. Now, it's very seldom in my experience to find two distinct levels of contradiction in a single sentence, but Hawking seems to have invented a sentence with three separate levels of contradiction. He says that the universe comes from a nothing that turns out to be something, self-contradiction number one. Then he says the universe creates itself, self-contradiction number two. But that's not all. His notion that a law of gravity explains the existence of the universe is also self-contradictory, since a law of nature by definition surely depends for its own existence on the prior existence of the nature that it purports to describe. So the main conclusion of this much vaunted book appears to be a triple self-contradiction. Philosophers, my philosophical friends, have been tempted to say, that is what comes of saying that philosophy is dead. And I want to say that it simply shows that nonsense remains nonsense even when it's talked about by world-famous scientists. And what serves to obscure the illogicality of such statements is the fact that they are made by famous scientists, and the general public, not surprisingly, assumes that they are statements of science. But I was glad that I learned early on in life that not every statement by a scientist is a statement of science. And any statement, whether made by a scientist or not, should be open to logical analysis. Immense prestige and authority does not compensate for faulty logic. Now, what I find extremely worrying about all of this is that this illogical notion is not some peripheral point in the grand design. It appears to be the key argument. And if the key argument is invalid, in one sense, there's very little left to say. However, since gravity, the law of gravity, plays such a signal role in Hawking's argument, I want to pursue this a little more, because I'm rather concerned of the impression the book gives as to the nature of physical law. And we shall see that as it comes. But let me go back, because I promised I would, to deal with this category mistake that's very common with Richard Dawkins, with whom I've debated the matter, and now Hawking. And that is to offer people a choice between God and, in Hawking's case, the laws of physics. Talking about M theory, his chosen candidate for a final unifying theory of physics, he said, it predicts that a great many universes were created out of nothing. Their creation does not require the intervention of some supernatural being or God. Rather, they arise naturally from physical law. That's an extremely interesting statement to me. And it's quite clear what the shift is here. Hawking is dismissing that notion and replacing it by the idea that creative power is possessed by physical law. But physical law is not an agent. Hawking is confusing, in a classical category mistake, two completely different kinds of entity, physical law and personal agency. So the choice that he sets before us is between false alternatives. To put it another way, he's confused two levels of explanation. God is an explanation of the universe, but not the same kind of explanation as you will get from physics. Now, it's very easy to see this. Suppose I replace the universe by a jet engine, and then we're asked to explain it. And suppose I say to you, I want to give you two choices to explain this jet engine. Choice number one is physical law, the laws of physics, and a bit of engineering, if you like. And choice number two is Sir Frank Whittle. Choose. Well, that's foolish. Because in order to give a complete description of the jet engine, in terms of both its function and its origin, you need both. You need an explanation in terms of law and engineering, and you need an explanation in terms of the agent who invented it. They don't compete, nor do they conflict. They are distinct levels. And therefore, it is very strange to find Dawkins and Hawking making what a philosophy 101 student could see to be a classical category mistake, which incidentally was not made by Sir Isaac Newton when he discovered the law of gravitation. He didn't say, now I understand I've got a law of gravitation, therefore I don't need God. Not at all. He did the exact opposite. He wrote one of the most brilliant books in the history of science, the Principia Mathematica, expressing the hope that it would, I quote, persuade the thinking man to. In other words, we're back to what I said earlier. The more that Newton understood, the more he admired the genius of God who was behind it. But it's even more interesting than that, at least I find it is. Because the laws of physics can explain how the jet engine works. They can't explain how it came to exist in the first place. It's self-evident it couldn't have been created by the laws of physics of their own. It needed Sir Frank Whittle. But even that's not enough. The laws of physics plus Frank Whittle could not actually produce a jet engine on their own. There also needed to be some material stuff around the place. Matter may be humble stuff, but it isn't produced by laws. Now, of course, the example can help clear up another confusion. Science, according to many scientists, concentrates essentially on material causation. It asks the how questions, how does the jet engine work? It also asks the why questions concerning function. Why is this microprocessor here and why is that pipe there? But it doesn't answer the why questions of purpose. So that if I'm giving a scientific account of a jet engine, I may not mention Sir Frank Whittle. But I'm giving only a partial account. I'm giving an explanation at the level of material causation, but I'm not giving a full explanation. It requires the agency as well. It would be utterly ridiculous to deduce from a complete physical explanation of a jet engine that Frank Whittle didn't exist. And yet it seems to me that that's what many scientists and others do with God. They define the range of questions which science is permitted to ask in such a way that God is excluded from the start, and then they say that God's unnecessary. But ladies and gentlemen, if I design a machine in the physics lab that can only see physical light, I can't then say that my machine doesn't detect X-rays, so therefore they don't exist. We need to examine the grid, the matrix of questions that appear, and to see if they grasp everything or not. They fail to see, I would submit to you, rather provocatively perhaps, that it's not their science, but their atheistic worldview that excludes God. Now, I have observed in life, perhaps you've noticed it, that scientists didn't put the universe there. But neither did their theories, nor the laws of mathematical physics. And yet, much as I find it hard to believe, Hawking seems to think they did. There's a program in this country, I believe, called Larry King Live. I don't watch it very often, but I did watch it when Hawking was on it. And when he was asked where gravity came from and so on, he said M theory. In other words, gravity has its origin in a theory. I thought for a moment, that's a very curious notion of what a theory is. Scientists expect to develop theories involving mathematical laws to describe natural phenomena, which enable them to make predictions, and they've done it with spectacular success. But on their own, theories and laws cannot create those phenomena. They are descriptions, usually mathematical, of what normally happens under certain given conditions. And what's more, this is totally obvious from the examples Hawking himself gives in his book. In order to make it accessible to ordinary people, he gives his first example of physical law. It is this: the sun rises in the east. That's a physical law. But this law doesn't create the sun, nor the planet Earth with east and west. It is descriptive and predictive, but it isn't creative. Newton's law of gravitation doesn't create gravity or the matter in which gravity acts. In fact, it doesn't even explain gravity, as Newton himself saw. But it's even worse, actually. Well, it depends on your perspective, of course. The laws of physics are not only incapable of creating anything, they can't even cause anything to happen. Newton's celebrated laws of motion never caused a pool ball to race across a pool table in the history of the universe. That can only be done by people using a pool cue and the actions of their own muscles. The laws enable us to analyze the motion and to map the trajectory of the ball for the first few bounces anyway, until all sorts of chaotic effects set in, provided nothing external interferes. But the laws are incapable of moving the ball, let alone creating it and the table in the first place. So what can Hawking possibly mean by suggesting that law creates the universe? Now, Paul Davis, with whom I've debated some of these things, a brilliant writer and at ASU in Phoenix, he says there's no need to invoke anything supernatural in the origins of the universe or of life. I've never liked the idea of divine tinkering. For me, it is much more inspiring to believe that a set of mathematical laws can be so clever as to bring all these things into existence. Well, in the world in which most of us live, the simple law of arithmetic, 1 + 1 = 2, never brought anything into being. It certainly has never put any money into my bank account. I wonder, has it done to yours? If I put $1,000 into the bank today and $1,000 tomorrow, the law of arithmetic will tell me I have $2,000. But if I never put any money into the bank myself and leave it to the laws of arithmetic to do it, I shall remain permanently bankrupt. To think that the laws can produce it is like thinking you can create real money by simply doing sums. For every says if you have A, then you will get B. But first catch your A. The laws will not do it for you. So I would submit to you that the world of strict naturalism, in which clever mathematical laws all by themselves bring the universe and life into existence, is pure science fiction. So Hawking has signally failed to answer his main question: why is there something rather than nothing? Alan Sandage, widely regarded as the father of modern astronomy, discoverer of quasars, winner of the Crawford Prize, and astronomy's equivalent of the Nobel Prize, is in no doubt about his answer to the question. I find it quite improbable, he wrote, that such order came out of chaos. There has to be some organizing principle. God to me is a mystery, but is the explanation for the miracle of existence, why there is something rather than nothing. Let me say some words about the grand design. Like every other physicist, Hawking is confronted with powerful evidence of his design, as he explains in great detail in his book. Our universe and its laws appear to have a design that is both tailor-made to support us, and if we are to exist, leaves little room for alteration. That is not easily explained. So he says, the discovery relatively recently of the extreme fine-tuning of so many of the laws of nature could lead at least some of us back to the old idea that this grand design is the work of some grand designer. That is not the answer of modern science. Our universe seems to be one of many, each with different laws. Now, there are many interesting things about this. First is, Hawking clearly recognizes a grand design. He gave that title to his book. He devotes almost an entire chapter to giving extensive details of spectacular fine-tuning. That certainly fits in with the old idea. But the question to ask is not, is an idea old, but is it true? And the implication often is that by describing an idea as old, it isn't true. And of course, that's nonsense. Some of the best ideas have been around for millennia. Now, Hawking says that the existence of a grand designer is not the answer of modern science. But what can he mean by that? Modern science is a set of disciplines done by modern scientists. Has he forgotten of the existence of Bill Phillips, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics in North America and still is teaching? He believes in the grand designer. Has he forgotten about the existence of Francis Collins, the former director of the Human Genome Project? And I could go on and on. In my own University of Oxford, there are several very distinguished scientists who, in common with Newton, Kepler, Galileo, and all the rest of them, believe that the reason we can do science at all is because it reflects the operation of a mind. That's a very old idea, of course, but it nonetheless a very powerful idea. So Hawking is going totally beyond the evidence to say that is not the idea of modern science. But his idea of what the answer is a multiverse, and he immediately makes the category mistake again. God of the multiverse. But God can create as many universes as he likes, can't he? How is a multiverse in itself an argument against the existence of a creator? Hawking certainly hasn't addressed that question, as many philosophers have not been slow to point out. Again, the easy slip into the false dichotomy, so that it means instinctively that if a scientist takes God seriously, they're not allowed to take the multiverse seriously. That's a very clever get-out, but it seems to me it won't do. Now, with his multiverse, Hawking moves beyond science, of course. As Paul Davies points out, all cosmological models are constructed by augmenting the results of observation by some sort of philosophical principle. Now, Hawking, as we saw, claims to be the voice of modern science, but as I read, I discover that there are other powerful voices disagreeing. For instance, Sir Roger Penrose, Hawking's former collaborator. His response to the book has been fascinating. Of the use of the multiverse, Penrose says it's overused. He doesn't like the term because it's inaccurate. And then he goes on to say about this M theory that Hawking claims is the unified theory that Einstein was expecting to find. Penrose says it is very far from testability. And he points out that Hawking's book is misleading. It gives you this impression of a theory that's going to explain everything. It is nothing of the sort. It is not even a theory. And Penrose's verdict is that M theory is hardly science. And we might observe that he is a member of the British Humanist Society. He is not a theist. Now, what's interesting to me about this is, one, the existence of multiverses isn't in itself an argument against God, so we can set that aside. But for Hawking to claim that this is the answer, with voices as strong as Penrose's, seemed to me to, well, I would want to wait a little while before I made such a strong assertion. And indeed, one of Hawking's students, Don Page, who's an eminent theoretical physicist now in the University of Alberta, wrote to me, I wrote to him about a letter he put in the Times, and he responded this way, and he's allowed me to quote it for you. I certainly would agree that even if M theory were a fully formulated theory, which it isn't yet, and were correct, which of course we don't know, that would not imply that God did not create the universe. I can't help sharing with you this marvelous review that appeared in one of our national newspapers. In this very brief history of modern cosmological physics, the laws of quantum and relativistic physics represent things to be wondered at, but widely accepted, just like biblical miracles. M theory invokes something different, a prime mover, a begetter, a creative force that is everywhere and nowhere. This force cannot be identified by instruments or examined by comprehensible mathematical prediction, and yet it contains all possibilities. It incorporates omnipresence, omniscience, and omnipotence, and it's a big mystery. Remind you of anybody? A move to advance the cause of atheism, ladies and gentlemen, by means of a highly speculative, untestable theory, which even if it were true, could not dislodge God in any sense, is not exactly calculated to impress those of us whose faith in God is not speculative, but is based on evidence-based rational thought. And I conclude with this. Much of the rationale behind Hawking's and other arguments lies in the idea that there's a deep-seated conflict between science and religion. This is not a discord that I recognize. In fact, I'd go further than that. I've had the privilege to work with two very distinguished historians of science in my career, Professor John Brooke and his successor, Professor Peter Harrison at Oxford. And what is very interesting, that with all kinds of nuances that can be made by the expert historians, one interesting focal point of history has been the explosive rise of science as we know it, that is modern science, in the 16th and 17th centuries. And C.S. Lewis got it pretty right, it seems to me, in the opinion of these experts, when he wrote these words. Men became scientific. Why? Because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. In other words, far from belief in God hindering science, it was the very motor that drove it. Now, identifying science as a rational activity helps me, it seems, to point up very clearly another very serious flaw in Hawking's thinking. Like Francis Crick, he wants us to believe that human beings are nothing but mere collections of fundamental particles of nature. In his reductionism, he reduces biology to physics and chemistry and concludes, it is hard to see how free will can operate if our behavior is determined by physical law. So it seems we are no more than biological machines, and that free will is just an illusion. It's logical. But rather than me comment on the philosophy of it, let's allow John Polkinghorne, who taught me quantum physics at Cambridge many years ago, to comment on it. In the opinion of many thinkers, Polkinghorne writes, human freedom is closely connected with human rationality. If we were deterministic beings, what would validate the claims that our utterance constituted rational discourse? Would not the sounds issuing from mouths or the marks we made on paper simply be the actions of automata? And he concludes, all proponents of deterministic theories, whether social and economic, Marx, or sexual, Freud, or genetic, Dawkins and E.O. Wilson, need a covert disclaimer on their own behalf, accepting their own contribution from reductive dismissal. Hawking seems to qualify to be added to the list. And I conclude by saying this. It may surprise you. My chief objection to the kind of atheism that Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow put in their book, my chief objection to it does not arise from the fact that I am a Christian. It arises from the fact that I believe that it's possible to do science. And it seems to me that their reductive arguments undermine the credibility of the rationality in which all scientists believe as a fundamental postulate in order to do science. And if I'm faced with two explanations of the universe, one that says in the end my mind is my brain and my brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process, as philosophers in increasing numbers are beginning to see, well, it's obvious anyway, why on earth would you trust an instrument of searching and knowledge that was constructed on the basis of a mindless, unguided process? In other words, this reductive atheism of the new atheistic type seems to me to undermine the very rationality that we do science with. In other words, their articulations are meaningless on the basis of their own theories. Makes much more sense to me, ladies and gentlemen, that the reason that we can do science, at least the reason that my little mind in here can understand a little bit of the big universe out there, is because ultimately both are traceable back to the same grand designer. Thank you very much.